Hilchos Maaser Perek Sheni, the laws of the 10% separation to the Levi, chapter 2. In this chapter, which is quite short, the Rambam discusses two principles related to Maaser. Number one, the obligation of tithing, biblically, only applies if you're taking the food home to eat, not if you're taking it to be sold. Taking it to be sold, only rabbinically obligated to be tithed. The second point discussed for most of the chapter is what's called Oynas HaMaasres. What is the point of time at which produce becomes obligated to be tithed? And the Rambam basically says that produce has to reach a third of its growth. And he gives a list going through many different species to define at what point is that produce reaching a third of its growth and therefore obligated to be tithed. That's where we're heading today. Says the Rambam halacha aleph ein chayav lahafrish min haTorah. Biblically speaking, a person is not obligated to separate maaser ala hagomer piroisav laochlan laatzmai. Only somebody who concludes, in other words, who completes the process of his produce to eat it for himself. Aval hagomer lemachran, but somebody who's completing the process to sell the produce, poter min haTorah v'chayav midivreim, is actually biblically exempt from separating maaser, only obligated rabbinically. Shanemar, because it says aser to aser. You have to take tithes, v'ochalta, only if you're eating it. The only person obligated is a person who is completing the process of his food to eat it. Halacha beis, on the other side, the buyer, the end user, pater min haTorah, biblically speaking, is exempt to tithe his produce that he buys. Shanemar, as it says, tevuas zarecha, you only have an obligation to tithe the grain of your seed. But rabbinically, the buyer is also obligated to tithe the produce that he buys. When do we say this? If he's buying the produce after the full process of work has been completed while it was still in the hands of the seller. That's when the obligation on the buyer is only rabbinic. But if the buyer bought the produce in an early stage of development and the process was completed, in the buyer's possession, chayav la'asr min haTorah, he's obligated biblically to take the tithes from his produce. Halacha gimel, peiros she'enon re'uyin la'achila bekatnan. Fruit that are not fit to be eaten because they're so small, they're so unripe. Like boiser. Boiser is usually a term used for unripe grapes. Einon chayavin b'maaser ad sheyigdalu v'yasu eichel. They're not obligated to be tithed until they grow and ripen and become edible food. Shanemar, as it says, mizera ha'aretz mipriya eitz. Tithes have to be taken from the seed of the ground, from the fruit of the tree, which means ad sheyeh pri, it has to have reached a stage at which it's called a fruit. And even though this verse only uses the word fruit, the same law applies to grain and to legumes. They have to be ripe or edible before you tithe them. Shanemar, as it says, eis kol tevuas zarecha. It has to be proper grain of your seed. Ad sheteyasa tevua, till it becomes proper grain. This is green grain, it's still unripe. You don't have to tithe it. V'zuhi Oynas HaMaasres. This is what we call, and this is going to be a term that's going to come up again and again, Oynas HaMaasres. Oynas HaMaasres literally means the time of tithing, but we're going to refer to it as the point of growth at which produce becomes obligated to be tithed. Before grain or fruit reach this point of growth, a person can eat from them whatever he wants, whatever way he wants, without tithing them. Halacha daled, peiros she'ein re'uyin la'achila bekatnan. Fruits that are able to be eaten in their stage of being small. Kegoin hakishuyim v'hamalafafainos. Like kishuyim is this type of, it's called cucumis mello in Latin, type of cucumber, and the regular cucumber. She'ein manichin leisanala kedei lehoisef begufan bilvad, that the only reason they be left in the ground is to increase their size. Avol re'uyin hein mitchila la'achila, but already at an earlier point, they're fit to be eaten. Hare'elu chayavin b'maaser bekatnan. And even when they're small, as long as they're edible, if you harvest them then, they have to be tithed. Because the moment they exited the ground, in a certain sense, so to speak. In other words, as soon as they become edible, they have already reached the Oynas HaMaasres, the point at which they're obligated to be tithed. And now, the Rambam goes through a list detailing many different type of species and at what point they're obligated to be tithed. Halacha hey, ezohi Oynas HaMaasres. What is considered the phase, the point, when fruit has an obligation to be taken maaser from? Mishiagiu ha'peiros hazriya, or lehazriya, should probably say. V'litzmayach, when a fruit reaches the point of time that it could produce seed that could then grow had it been replanted. Hakel lefi mashehu apri, and this varies according to whatever fruit we're talking about. Ketzad, what's an example or some examples? Hate'enim, figs, the Rambam begins with. The point of Maaser for them is Mishaya Asu Rakim Ad Sheyuhu Ru'uyim La'achila Achar Esrim Ba'arba Shoyis Mishas Hasifasan. To the point that they become so soft that if you pick them, after 24 hours, they'll already be fit for eating. That's the point at which figs have to be tithed. Ha'anavim b'hab'ushim, grapes and be'ushim. Be'ushim are a term, v'heim ha'anavim hadakim hamidbariyos. They are thin, desert-growing grapes. The point of Maaser for grapes is mishayirah hachartzon shalahem mibachutz, when their seed can be seen from the outside. Now, most grapes today, first of all, besides for the seedless grapes, so you have no seeds anyways, but proper grapes that grow with seeds, at the point of their full ripening, the skin is actually dark and you can't see the seed. But the Rambam writes in his commentary to the Mishnah that there's actually a point of development in the grape where it crosses from being fully unripe to beginning the ripening stage. At that point, actually, the skin of the grape becomes clear and you are able to see from the outside, as in this picture here. Here it's more because the sun is shining on the grapes, but I just for illustration purposes, to bring out how you can actually see the seed from the outside at an earlier point in the grape's development. That's the point at which the grape is obligated to be tithed. Harimainim, pomegranates, mishayimas hapered shalahen bein ha'etzbois. When the meat, the flesh, in other words, the white part between the seeds, as you can see on the screen here, when it becomes soft enough that it can be crushed between the fingers, v'yetze mimenu mayim, and water or liquid will come out if it's pressed. Hatmarim, dates, mishayipaschu kisa'oyer, when they begin to open like sourdough. Basically, when dates begin to ripen, there's a point at which they go through like a little bit of an explosive spurt. They're very, very small, and then they begin to kind of open up, like a sourdough would begin to rise. At that point, they're obligated to be tithed. Ha'afarsikim, peaches, mishayatilu gidim adumim, when red strands begin to appear in them. Here you can see a peach in its early ripening stages. It's pretty much green, but these small red parts, this is a little bit even more advanced, but these small red parts begin to appear in them. At that point, they become obligated to be tithed. Ha'egoizim, walnuts, when the food inside separates from the outer shell. When you open up a walnut, typically you're able to extract the inside easily. That's because the inside has separated from the shell. Earlier in its growth, it's attached to the shell. And so, when it detaches, that's the point that it's obligated to be tithed. Hashkedim hamesukim, sweeter almonds, almonds are dictated by the same laws when they separate from their outer shell. Hamarim, if they're bitter almonds, as we said yesterday, p'turin la'ilam, they're always exempt from being tithed because they're not fit for human consumption. Ushar kol bale klipos, any other nuts basically that grow in shells. Kigoin ha'itzterublin. Itzterublin are typically translated as pine cones, the edible pine cones. V'haloit v'habotnim, hazelnuts and pistachios. That's the Rambam's definition of these two terminologies. Mishayasu klipa ha'tachtoina hasmucha la'oicha. When the inner shell forms, the one that's close to the food. Because if you know hazelnuts, they grow in two shells. They grow in the outermost shell, when you buy them raw in the supermarket, and then even if you crack that outer shell, there's still another shell right near the food. So that's the one we're talking about. When that shell forms, they're obligated to be tithed. Hazesim, olives, mishayasu shemen echad mitisha, mimashein ru'uyin lasis kishiyigamru. When they reach the point that they can produce a ninth of their full capacity oil production. Whatever a fully ripe olive would produce, when it can produce 1/9 of that, it has to be tithed. That's the third of their growth. Hatapuchim, apples and esrog, citrus fruits, mishayis aglu, when they form a circular shape, because they can be eaten as they are when they're small. Hatusim v'ha'oig. Tusim, in modern Hebrew, tutim are strawberries, but in halachic Hebrew, tusim are mulberries. These ones on the side. Oig is called sumac berries. They're a berry that grows on the sumac plant, much smaller. Mishayadimu. When they become red, that's when they're obligated to be tithed. Similarly, any fruit that goes through a reddening stage, when it reddens, it's obligated to be tithed. Hecharuvin, caribs, mishayasu, nekudes shcheires, when they achieve the black dots inside their shell. So to any plant or fruit that becomes black, when it gets the dots, is when it has to be tithed. Ha'agosim. Agosim are regular pears. V'hakrustumelin. Krustumelin are either tiny apples, like this one over here. Others say they're a type of Roman type of apple. We had them in the beginning of the Rambam in the 4th chapter of the laws of Deus, when the Rambam was talking about the proper diet for a person. He also mentioned Krustumelin. V'haprishim and quinces. V'ha'uzradin. Uzradin are either azarol plant or sorb, one of these two fruits. Mishayasu karaches levanos. When they get little small white spots on them, that's when they are obligated to be tithed. V'chin kol shedarkan lahalbin mishayikruchu karaches. So to anything that will ultimately become whiter or lighter, when it gets those white dots, it's obligated to be tithed. Hatvua, regular grain, mishatavi shlish, when it produces a third of its growth. Hatiltan, fenugreek over here, mishayiyazara roy litzmichaim nizra, when its seed is fitting to be replanted, if it is fitting to grow, if it would be replanted. That's all for fruit and for grain. Uva yarak, vegetables. Hakishuin, the cucumber mellow again. V'hadluin, calabash squash. V'havatichin, watermelons. V'hamalafafainis, regular cucumbers. V'chol kayetzeb, and anything like them. Chayavin bekatnan kamesha bi'arnu, they're already obligated to be tithed, even in smaller stages, as we already explained in the last halacha. Ushar hayarak, she'enei rei la'achila ad sheyagdil, any other vegetables which cannot be eaten until they become fully ripe. Einei chayav ad she'enei rei la'achila, you're only obligated when they're actually fit to be eaten. Eshkel shehigia bayafilu gargir yichidi, if you have a cluster of grapes, where even one grape ripened, kulei chibur lemaisres, the entire cluster is considered attached for the sake of tithing. Uki'ilu higia kulei, and we look at it as if the entire cluster ripened, because once one grape ripens, the other ones are following fast behind, and they're all obligated to be tithed. The truth is not only that cluster, the entire side of the vine, which that cluster is growing on, is also considered to be obligated to be tithed at that point. The same thing for a pomegranate tree. If even one pomegranate fully ripened, kula chibur, that entire side, like with the vines, the entire side is considered connected and has to be tithed. Halacha vav lo yimkar adam piraisav misha bo lo einas hamaisres lemi she'enei neman al hamaisres. When a person's produce has reached the point that it has to be tithed, you may not sell it to somebody who's not trusted about tithing. Now, this is going to be a term that's going to come up again and again in these laws. There were certain Jews who were careful to tithe their produce, and other Jews were called am haaretz, ignoramuses. They didn't know much, they weren't familiar, and they didn't tithe their produce. Whenever they have produce and you buy it from them, because they're not trusted about tithing, you have to tithe it again. It's also called demai. We had it before in the last set of laws. Demai means, what is this? Questionable produce. So if you have produce that needs to be tithed, you cannot sell it at this point to a person who's not trusted about tithing. V'im bikru, if only a portion of your produce ripened, they ripened early, neitelas habakurais, take whatever grew early, umutar limkar hashar sha'adayin lo yigia le'inasar ma'asers, and you can sell off the rest, which hadn't yet reached the point of being obligated to be tithed. V'chein lo yimkar adam es giftoi ve'ezaga, a person should not sell his garbage olives and garbage grapes. In other words, whatever remains of the olives and the grapes after they've been pressed, lemisha eina neman ala maisres, to somebody who's not trusted on Maaser, l'hoitzi mihen mashkin, just to extract more liquid, because that liquid will be obligated to be tithed. Sha'mashkin mayetzim and chayavim b'maisers, because any liquid which exudes will be obligated to be tithed, and this person is not trusted on tithing. V'loyes tivnoi lilkat menu tvua, l'misha eina neman, nor should you give your straw after threshing, after winnowing, which there's probably no more kernels remaining, but there might be some. You cannot give it to a person who isn't trusted on Maaser. Because any new kernels which will be extracted from that straw will be obligated to be tithed. Halacha zayin, shmorei yayin, shenosan aleihem mayim v'sinanon. You have wine dregs on which you poured water and then strained it. Because the wine dregs obviously can't be eaten, but then you would pour water over it to extract whatever other wine could be found in the dregs. So the Rambam says, Im nasan shleisha matzarba, if you put in 3 measures of water and you came out with 4 measures, in other words, there's now a ratio of 3-1, essentially, in the wine. Moitzi meiser mizeh hayeser mimakem acher. So whatever came out with the water is considered to be wine and needs to be tithed from another source. As we learned yesterday, you can take meiser from one area to another. Ve'enei mafresh alav truma, but you don't have to take truma for this new wine which you discovered. As we explained in the laws of truma, when you take truma, you purposely have in mind that it should cover whatever wine will be left in the wine dregs. Now, when you take Maaser, you can't do that, because Maaser, as we learned yesterday, also has to be separated exactly, no approximation. You have to take 1/10 from whatever you have. So you couldn't have included the wine in the dregs. Now that you've gotten this wine out of the dregs, you must take a new Maaser. Matzah paches me'arba. If you got less than 4 measures from 3 measures of water, afal pisha matzah yesed al midasei, the afal pisha yesh bahen tam yayin, even though you got more than you put in. And even if it tastes like wine, pater, it's exempt from Maaser, because if it's no 3-to-1 ratio, it's not considered wine according to halacha. Halacha ches, hamakdish peireisav k'shehein mechubarin. A person declared all his grain, or all his produce, hekdesh, holy to the temple treasury, while they were still attached to the ground, ad shalei bo la'einas hamaiser, before reaching the point of a third of their growth, when they're obligated to be tithed. Upidan, then he buys them back, he redeems them back from the temple treasury. The achasha padan higiu, and after he redeemed them, they reached that point of obligation of tithing, chayavin b'maiser. They're obligated to be tithed, because right now, when they reached the point of obligation, they were not owned by the temple treasury, they were owned by a regular Jew. But if they reached the time of tithing, while they were in the hands of the temple treasury, the achakach padan, and only afterwards you redeem them, now they're exempt. Because when they reached the point of tithing, they were owned by the temple treasury. Temple treasury doesn't have an obligation to separate Maaser, and therefore even if you buy it from them, you're also exempt from tithing this produce.